Okay, welcome. Really lovely to see so many people signed up, and I was really excited that so many people have signed up. I've been talking about this issue for about 2 years from an academic perspective, and it was so exciting to think that now that I'm ready to share things that I found and at a point in the journey where I feel like changes can happen, that we've had such an overwhelming number of people wanting to be involved and just hear what's happening. So thank you all for signing up, and I hope that it's a really productive session for everybody. So the session is on how to prevent the underachievement rather than how to respond to underachievement that is happening. And I feel like they're two very different strategies. And also the session today is very much strategy focused rather than sort of quick wins that we might like to see that sometimes go flying around as well. I've popped up on the top if you'd like to share your thoughts. So NTLD Bucks, who have got lots of amazing sessions on today. I'm pretty much jam-packed for the rest of the day as well. Please do share any thoughts there. And my details are on there as well if you want to get in touch with me directly. Okay, so in this session, we're going to think about how well Pakistani boys actually do in British schools as opposed to schools around the world. What some of the significant wider experiences of Pakistanis in Britain are. And I think that's a really important thing to understand if we're going to understand what the attainment of these boys in schools is and why that might be. And then I've got a three-pronged strategy that I think would be a really effective thing for schools to take on board if they are going to tackle this attainment gap. So it's anti-racism education, parental engagement, and working on reading ages and vocabulary use. So what does the data actually say? So this was published in April this year, and it's based on last year's data. And you can see that I've not put every ethnic group in here that's across the spectrum. Indian and Chinese boys tend to do much better than boys from other ethnic groups. So I put them in so you know what sort of the top end of the data looks like. White British boys tend to be doing worse and worse actually in recent years. And Pakistani boys are not the only underachieving group. So I have left other groups out, but that's not because they're not important or that their data doesn't tell us anything interesting. It's just because they're not the focus of this session. But what you can see is that Pakistani boys do underachieve quite significantly in comparison to our top attaining boys. And I think one of the most important pieces of data on there is the expected standard age 4 to 5 years old. And there's lots of research that suggests that how students do age 4 to 5 will be a really good indicator of how well they'll do up to and including the age of 16. So if only 57% of Pakistani boys are meeting expected development age 4 to 5, the story for them at what that's going to do when they're 16 doesn't look very positive. So the DFE published a paper on this in 2016 and said that students are less able to do well in all subjects if they can't read well by the middle of primary school. And you can see from the reading ages, so I've only put reading age data on here, we've got a huge gap in how well Pakistani boys are doing in reading ages by the middle of primary school. And the EEF put a article out a couple of years ago on reading capability being the best predictor for progress in science specifically. So there was loads of talk about reading being a useful indicator for progress in humanities and English subjects. And then there was some more research that said actually it underpins progress in science. And there was another recent one about maths as well. And the other thing that I think is really important to know is your school's own internal data. So having a look at things like the exclusion percentages, number of boys in detentions, parents evening attendance, co-curricular involvement, attendance on trips, attendance data, and behaviour versus praise points. And that might tell you a very particular story about your own school as well. So in the school that I've trialled this, we have seen a lesser engagement from our Pakistani boys at co-curricular involvement. About 50% of non-attendance at parents' evening was Pakistani parents, but only 15% of the year groups are. So that's a really significant figure, and it tells us a really interesting story about engagement with school life overall for this group, rather than just looking at the grade data. I don't think the grade data tells us everything it is that we need to know. And I'll come back a little bit later as to why I've used reading age data in that specifically, and why I think schools need to use reading age data throughout Key Stage 2 and 3 as well, a little bit later in the session. So for the purposes of this then, what can I really do in 40 minutes? So there are 4 things I guess that we need to be on board with for this session. So one is that Pakistani boys are the focus. There are other groups who underachieve too, but this just happens to be the focus of this particular research project. I'm going to assume that we all want to and should do something about this. And you sometimes hear this rhetoric that the gap won't ever be closed. And I'm possibly a believer in never closing the gap, but I don't think that we should have a gap that is grouped by ethnicity. That seems to be a really strange thing to be comfortable with. That gaps will exist, but as long as the gaps are grouped by ethnicity or grouped by gender or grouped by deprivation, then it's okay. And that doesn't seem okay. So this isn't a conversation about gaps necessarily. It's just about injustice more. Other strategies could work too, and probably would work too. These are just the three that I've started working on and that research suggests would be really helpful. And also I'm at the start of this journey, so if you signed up hoping that I will tell you of a wonderful success story of a school in Buckinghamshire who's managed to crack this, and we fixed potentially 3 generations of injustice and poor economic growth, socioeconomic growth, then I'm afraid that won't be what the answer is. So I'm very much at the start of this journey, and this hopefully will start some really important conversations across schools and other professionals too. So before I can talk about the strategies, I think it's important for us to think about what the perceptions and experiences of Pakistani groups are in Britain, because that feeds into why we see an attainment gap in schools. So if you've not read this book, I can't recommend it enough. Summer is a fantastic researcher, and she's written this book, Muslim Mothers and Their Children's Schooling. It's about 4 years old, I think, and it is essentially a sociological examination of the perspectives of Muslim mums across Britain, across socioeconomic and ethnic groups, and their perspectives on education in Britain. It's very interview based, and it's a really interesting read. So to give you a snapshot of the kinds of things that are said in there, we've definitely seen a real shift from identifying Pakistani learners or people to identifying them as Muslim instead. And this shift has really happened since 9/11. And there's a few quotes there from the book that I'll let you guys just read through that sort of supports this. And really, it's quite an important shift, not only because it opens up the scope of who we include when we talk about Pakistani students in schools, but also because the term Muslim has a very different weighting. So that final quote where it says, I think the reason why I'd say Muslim mother is because there are a lot of things that differentiate, and she's talking about differentiate us from other mothers. And this mother goes on to talk about, things like engagement in PE and pubescent girls being involved in swimming lessons in mixed sex settings, uniform, food, and whether the food in the canteen is going to be halal. So the Muslim prefix to their motherhood seems to feature really highly in how they engage in the schooling experience. And that's really important when we go on to think about how the term Muslim has been understood in wider society. So without, being able to give you an entire sociological understanding of this, I've picked a couple of areas that I think are ones that we can't ignore. So the first obvious one is what's going on in the media. And we don't tend to see very positive headlines about Muslims in the media. So the Muslim Council of Britain did a study that showed that 59% of news stories about Muslims are negative. 78% of featuring Muslims in the Mail on Sunday were negative. And that is phenomenal. And there's a small snapshot of what those are just there, but we'll go into some more examples of these a little bit later. And it may be the case that I've picked newspapers that intentionally use provocative headlines, and of course these provocative headlines about other groups too, but that doesn't take away from the experience of the Muslims that are having to read this about themselves, essentially. And if you've not read this, I can highly recommend it. I'm reading it at the moment. I've not quite finished yet, but Akala recognises this as well. And he says that the slew of racist abuse and virulent hate that can be found in any thread online discussing the Grenfell victims, who happen to be disproportionately Muslims, and the conceptual linking of the dead families, the terrorists of London Bridge and Manchester in the previous month, speaks loudly of how Muslim has become a racialised, culturally essentialist category in 21st century Britain. And I think that's probably, you know, that's Akala saying everything that I wanted to say in the first 10 minutes in that little soundbite there. And that idea of Muslim becoming a racialized term is really important, especially when we see that the term Pakistani seems to be, by Pakistani Muslims and by society, being replaced by the term Muslim instead. And then we can turn to social media. So there was some really interesting research on how young people get their news. And Ofcom released this in 2019, so not that long ago, and says that students tend to use social media as a main source of news. They'll tend to look at the comments on an article rather than read the full article themselves. And they will probably identify stories by what other people have shared, rather than actively going and seeking stories. So this is from Twitter that I took earlier in the last few weeks. So Tory Party have put out this post, Happy Father's Day, a cute little picture and a couple of emojis. And the first few comments that I found were, is he sure he's his real dad? As a white man, I'm beginning to feel the equivalent of one of those toppled statues. This is racist. Disgusting, it's predominantly white nation. Why will the adverts black people? TV newscasters mainly black too. Are us white dads included in your message? And that's not me trawling through to find hate. This is, you can see from the timings that they've been written in that they're just screenshots. This was the sort of common theme of comments that came up here, just because it is a black gentleman and a child, a black child with him, which sort of engages with the race idea. But if we look at the representation of Muslims on social media, we get a really hateful picture. Again, just a snapshot. So Steve Baker is my local MP, and he posted this Eid message, which he tends to do every Eid, actually. And the comments that he gets are very similar. So there's an interesting question about why he or his office don't monitor the comments, don't respond to the comments, or delete them. And he will repeatedly make Eid messages, knowing that these comments are happening. But I mean, that's another very interesting conversation to be had about the responsibility of people who tweet. But so one person, I don't recall Happy Christmas or Happy Easter from them. I've left the flags in there because in my experience, and of course this is just an experience observation, the use of the Union Jack and the American flag there is really common when I see comments of hate. And I think that tells us a really interesting story as well about the fact that we are promoting British values, and this idea of being proud to be British seems to be a real common trend that's still infiltrating into society and into schools. But actually for some people, it's not as comfortable as an association as we might want it to be. And there's a few more there. So claiming that it's a Christian country, so we shouldn't be doing things like this. They've arrived in the masses, and we've had cultural breakup and lots of death as a result. Some swearing down at the bottom, linking to Islamic terrorism, linking to raping children. After Ramadan, we don't want to hear the call to prayer like they intend to. I'm not sure where that intention came from. It's a Christian country, don't forget that. And that idea of it being a Christian country has come up again and again. And you can see also that these comments are not one-off. They are me just taking snapshots of the first tweets that came, the first responses that came up, and how many times they've been liked and retweeted, I think is quite important as well. And if we're saying that young people are getting their information from social media and using the comments rather than the actual posts or the actual stories, then what they're engaging with, and what a lot of our Pakistani or Muslim students are engaging with, is a pretty negative picture of what it means to be Muslim, which isn't great. So one other thing that I think is quite an important feature is this idea of community guilt. I've seen that Matt Pinkett has signed up for my session, which was quite exciting, and I've quoted him here. So I've referenced his book here, so I'll come back to that in a second.
Thank you.
Thank you. So this page isn't about Matt Pinkett, but I put the book there because I think there's some interesting things in there that this piece of evidence should be used in conjunction with. So Joanne Britton wrote this paper in 2018, Muslim men, racialized masculinities and personal life. And she again talks about this idea that Muslim is often used as interchangeable with Pakistani, and that comes up again and again in the research as well. And in personal experience from someone who is Pakistani and is Muslim, I from personally and from people that I know who have similar identities, it feels a very common thing to be able to do now, a very comfortable way of identifying. And she talks about Muslim men particularly being problematized in the media, senses of criminality, cultural dysfunction, being outsiders, lawbreakers, and lacking positive affective ties. And a lot of those things are things that Matt talks about in this book, and that Mark Roberts talks about in this book as well. So identity of what it means to be masculine, of mental health and well-being as well. And the positive affective ties is something that he talks about a lot. And if we see that this is a problem for Muslim men, the research is telling us it seems to be a problem for Muslim men in how they're represented, then we know that there's a real battle for them in overcoming these challenges, and that schools can do some of the work, but there is a lot of work to be done. But she talks specifically about the Rotherham grooming scandal, sort of 1997 to 2013. I'm terrible with dates, I should have written that down. I think that's right. And one of the guys says this, he says, for me, it's sort of the collective guilt of the whole Pakistani community, Muslim community, but in particular of men, despite the actions of a tiny minority, dare I say, a significant minority. It's the idea that still how each and every single one of us was culpable or somehow responsible for some of the horrible stuff that went on. You know, it's a sort of innuendo comments from liberals, from people, from politicians, to outright racist comments from bigots who don't know any better. But it's not that sort of collective tearing of us all. And there's lots of important things that Samu says in there. This idea that he seems to be sort of accepting that bigots are going to say really racist, abusive comments. You know, those things that were on the previous slide. It seems like Samu sort of has reconciled that these sorts of things happen. And I recently did an assembly to some of my students, and I sort of said that I've learned to navigate racial injustice, and that's a horrible thing to be comfortable with, but I've just sort of learned to do it. But actually, it's the dealing with the what we might call microaggressions. I'm not sure how micro and aggressing can be, from people who are seemingly liberal, seemingly open-minded, seemingly accepting, or tolerant, another word that I'm not particularly comfortable with, or people in positions of power. And those are the things that actually are really difficult to overcome, because it's hard to pin it down. It's hard to prove the intentions behind what is said. And you sort of end up having to play this victim role of defending your feelings, which is a really difficult thing to do. But because Joanne Britton talks about men in particular there, I think that's really important. And it's important because a lot of other people in this research study that Joanne presents also talk about the need for to talk to our sons more about this, to talk to our daughters more about this, to be more open in our communities about this, and in recognizing, look, this is a way that we are seen. You have to be better, and you have to know that people think this about you before you even meet them. And that's a really sad state of affairs for a parent to have that conversation with their children. So before kids are even coming to us, this is what they are dealing with. And then a snapshot of what things are like in schools themselves. So some of this is anecdotal. In fact, almost all of it is anecdotal. So you'll excuse me while I just literally read out for you experiences of either myself or students that I know. So Pakistani students have told me that staff don't know them apart. They're not apologetic when they get it wrong. Chinese students have reported that since the COVID outbreak, comments of hate and accusations about the source of the virus have been common. When I personally asked a family member if they'd go back to the school they came from to talk about their successes or do an assembly, he told me, no, never. It was clear they just saw me as another Pakistani boy likely to misbehave or fail, and I did well in spite of them, not because of them. BAME students are underpredicted on A-level grades across the country. I've heard staff members refer to Asian lads in the form not participating in form activities that I was in charge of organising. When I asked which lads were not participating, I was told, I don't know their names, just the Asian ones are really not participating. I've been confused for other Pakistani staff members repeatedly, and when corrected, those staff members have said, oh yes, the other one, or oh sorry, it's because your names both begin with S, although I've never been confused for any white colleagues who begin with S. I was once asked if I put my wedding dress in the RS cupboard as an artefact. I've been asked if my wedding was back home, and when I later challenged this, stating that Britain is my home, the apology somehow turned into me being told that it's harder for white students to get into Oxford than it is for black boys, and I don't really know how that came about. I listened to racist comments from students in my class to other students. When I reported to the head of year, I was told to consider where the students are coming from, and nothing further happened. As a student, I was repeatedly singled out with the only other person of colour in the room. Do either of you know what gnocchi is? And that's a great achievement for you. And in a task to create a family dessert, that selection isn't really a family dessert, despite the fact that my family flipping love jam roly-poly. as a primary age child, I was once given a black doll as a party favour. The child who handed it to me was actually a child I was bullied by, and I thought they were my friend, laughed and said, "Here you go, you can have this one." As everyone joined in the laughter, I didn't really understand what was so funny, because I loved the idea of having an ethnic doll, but somehow they believed it to be an insult. I was once told by a student, "I'm not racist, miss, but you should go back to where you came from." And she genuinely didn't believe she was being racist. I called a senior leader out once for singling me out in the staff room about my Pakistani identity. She told me she needed to be more careful about what she said, and I felt like telling her she needed to be more careful about what she thinks. These are all anecdotal, but they're still really important. And some are from my childhood. But if education, how we approach race in education hasn't changed, I don't know why we'd assume the experiences of BAME children in British schools today is any different. So these are all the things that these boys are coming to us with before they've even got through the door. So the solutions to these are huge. And I accept that they're not things that a school alone can be in charge of fixing. Things to note though, I think that these are long-term goals. I'm looking for things that are sustainable and that we can embed. And I do think it needs to be a multi-pronged attack. So number one, I think we need to look at anti-racism education. I know this is a really hot topic at the moment, which is quite exciting, but I think we need to split it into two categories. One, first of all, is CPD for all staff, anti-racism CPD, equity and inclusion training for the classroom, but also for recruitment and all other school behaviours. You know, things like do your co-curricular things, promote equity, do your assembly opportunities, your trip opportunities, promote equity. Thinking about ethical leadership rather than any form of management, you know, doing the things because they're the right things to do, not just doing jobs because they need to get done. I put a question mark next to unconditional bias. There is a worry with training on unconditional bias that people go away accepting that they have a bias and that they're never going to be able to fix it. So perhaps it's a useful thing to do, but it has to sit alongside a wider CPD programme. And I don't think you can look at curriculum review, or you should look at curriculum review, until you've done this CPD work. Otherwise, what you may end up with is lots of what may feel like quick wins, but actually, if they're not feeding into a bigger strategy and they're not feeding into a common goal and a bigger agenda, then they may just fall as things that might get dropped by the next year, that when a new teacher comes in, they don't know how to teach it, or they don't see the purpose and the pedagogy behind it. I'm still working on a lot of this, but here are some things that I have looked at that I think are handy. So there's a few people up there who I've been following and I've been reading who have been giving me some really great insights into how this could work. And in terms of curriculum review, I've been working with Facing History and Ourselves UK for about 6 years now, and they are fantastic. And they have some great resources, but they've got a really good pedagogy that deals well into an anti-racism education. So I highly recommend taking a look at what they're up to. And if you are looking for subject specific things, they have whole schemes of work on a range of things. So they've got things on inspector calls, on the Holocaust and human behaviour. They've got one on standing up for democracy, which is kind of a curriculum response to schools having to deal with a prevent agenda. To Kill a Mockingbird, and they've got loads of stuff on civil rights. So I highly recommend looking at what they're up to. The second thing is parental engagement. So I popped Summer's book back up there again. So one thing that comes out in this book again and again and again is that Muslim mums want to engage. And I've mentioned mums particularly because in the Muslim communities of Britain, we tend to see mums play a bigger role in the schooling of their children, in the academic schooling of their children, than we do the dads. So there's a few things there that I have tried that do seem to be working. So that middle one I have done, so calling parents when trips are advertised, and it's a bit of a headache, but I remember doing a trip and a senior leader saying to me, calculate the cost as though you get about 80% sign up, because you won't get 100%, and you've got a lot of Pakistani boys who don't tend to sign up to trips. And I just thought, challenge accepted. So I got 100%. But the way I did it was calling parents, and I called them the day the letter went home, and I called them a week later, and I called them the third week when the deadline had gone, and I got 100% attendance. So yeah, it's a bit of a headache, but it did prove that with that time being put in, it's not that engagement is not desired by the parents, it's just that having that facilitated is what's needed. Releasing parents' evening appointments early. I don't know how you do this in your schools, but in our school, parents can log in online and sign up for parents' evening appointments. And we have noticed that there is a bit of an IT gap for some of the parents, actually, not really knowing how to log in or where the password is or how many appointments they can make and the such like. So there is a bit of an issue with that as well. But also there's an option of releasing the parents' evening appointments early. So if we know that last year, this 15% of parents did not attend parents' evening, release appointments a day early, phone them and say they're there now, do a video call, screen share, show them how to do it, navigate them through how to make those appointments. And for your year sevens, perhaps use reading age data to prioritise appointments. In our own setting, and this seems to be a national trend as well, reading age data tends to be a really good indicator of how well people are doing. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Appy, I can see that you've raised your hand. I'm running a little bit low on time, so if you don't mind, I'll wait until I've got through everything and then come back to you. And trying to find positive reasons to come into school, I think, is really important. There's lots of really interesting research on if parents themselves did not do well in school and they don't have positive associations with the school experience, then coming to parents' evenings can be a really anxious time, and it can be something that they feel really uncomfortable doing. So finding positive reasons to come into the school are a really good idea. So things like a hog race for the spring fair might not be that enticing for your Muslim intake, but a community iftar maybe. And we've done this for a few years now, and it's worked incredibly well. And what's really lovely is that we get attendance from wider community members, Muslim and non-Muslim. We've got boys that attend and they will fast for the day because they just want to know what it's like for their Muslim friends, and they don't have to, but they choose to. Lots of staff attendance, and it's lovely to just see parents and staff engaging about something that has nothing to do with whether your son has done his maths homework this week or whether he has been late to form time this week. And it is just about a positive affiliation with something that the boys feel very strongly about and their families feel strongly about. And that's been amazing for us, really amazing for us. And we're looking at other ways that we can extend that, perhaps into coffee mornings as well, which might also be helpful. And then the third strand is improving reading ages. So reading age at age 5 will predict outcomes at age 15 or 16. An increased vocab will have an impact on learning in all subjects. And again, there's lots of research that that talks about this. And I think that there are quite a few things to consider with regard to reading ages. There's a whole list of some strategies down there. I do think reading ages are a better indicator of progress than internal data. You know, Ofsted don't look at our internal data, and all schools are using internal data in their own way. From research that I've done on ourselves, all of our subject leaders are doing really interesting things with how they use their data and how they use it to inform intervention. But because of the way that they teach, because of their teaching personalities, because of their pedagogies, and because of what their subjects demand, we're not all doing it in the same way. And it wouldn't be right for us all to do it in the same way because it wouldn't be effective. But it means that it's really hard to use it as a gauge of how well a boy is doing, a student is doing. A better thing for the moment is probably using reading age data. So if your schools are signed up to something like Accelerated Reader, I know there's lots of ones on the market at the moment, there's lots of free ones as well. It's a completely bias-free objective measure of how reading age is improving. And we know that reading age underpins progress longer term. So whether or not they've made progress in a half term doesn't really matter. If their reading age is growing, then we're going to see progress in the longer term. And shifting the language to thinking about the longer term goal is probably what we need to do. I should also note that this is very much a secondary idea. In primary schools, I realised that progress happens more quickly, and you can see progress in about 6 weeks. So there may be other things in primary schools that are also really effective. So things like range of books in the library, thinking about reading skills rather than just reading. You know, how many of our teachers really understand reading skills? It's very new to me. I've never really thought about it before. I've recently gone through my resources where I've thought I've got loads of really great challenging reading, and what I've done is assess the reading age of the materials I've got, and it's made me realise why there is such a gap in the attainment of tasks that are based on these reading. Because when I compare with the reading age the boys have, actually I've sort of pitched it far too high, assuming that the general reading age is a lot higher than it is. Even if the boys are very intelligent, there are certain barriers that are stopping them from achieve when the reading ages are considered too. Book clubs are an idea, and having targeted book clubs and thinking about the types of books you're including. So when we talk about anti-racism education, that may feed into the type of book club you're doing. And I think a parent book club would be a great idea. This is a very new idea to me. It's maybe not a new idea generally, but having a book club where the boys and the parents are reading the same book together might be a great idea. And I know that's something that I've enjoyed with my parents as well. And I didn't do that growing up. And it's suddenly something that we fall into by reading things that I know we've got mutual interest in. Getting the tutors on board with this. Audiobooks, particularly over lockdown, although there are other benefits to reading a physical book that you don't get with an audiobook. increasing your literacy can still be found as a benefit in audiobooks. And I've mentioned reading ages on resources. One other thing that we were hoping to do, and because we've not had our induction day with the year sixes this year, is to actually use that first induction day to do a reading age assessment, so we can figure out whether what their reading age is, and then use that to figure out what reading we can give them over the summer, so that they're not starting year 7 on the back foot. If we do a reading age assessment in year 7 first term, and then they hit the ground running, new school, secondary school, loads of subjects, and their reading age is already a barrier to them catching up with anybody else, or them sort of performing to the best of their abilities, that might be the wrong phrase, then if we can give reading intervention as a summer holiday project, that might help with that. We've not been able to trial it this year. We're hoping to trial it next year. And Accelerated Reader can do some cool stuff where you don't have to buy new accounts. So there is a cost involved, but what you can do is delete perhaps your year 8 or year 9 accounts for their final summer term and rename them with your new year 6s. And it's a little bit complicated with GDPR because you can't give them their actual names, but it is possible. We figured it out and it is possible. And other things that are good to read, which I'm sure lots of you already know about, but these are ones that I've been reading about recently, and thinking about reading age and vocabulary is quite new to me. This is probably the strand that I need to do the most work on at the moment. David Dido also, really interestingly, I think it was 2017, wrote a blog post having read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, another excellent book, basically accepting that he'd sort of been writing from a very white-centric perspective, and that was something he needed to consider. And I was really excited to see that there was an engagement with this. So one thing I have noticed with some of the material out there, and I hope Matt doesn't mind me saying this, but in Boys Don't Try, fantastic book, but I found myself thinking a lot of the research I have about the Pakistani boys that I've been thinking about, this research doesn't match up necessarily, and that there's other gaps that need to be filled there. So I do think that a lot of the research that's out there is very white-centric, and so it's why I think that improving reading ages should be our third strand. You have to get the other two right first. So final things that I think need to be said. One, there is lots to do. This is not a quick fix solution type of idea, but there's lots to do because we want sustainable and embedded changes for long-term success. We've been seeing attainment gaps for 3 generations, and this current generation are dealing with struggles that the ones before them didn't have to. You know, they've got all those things that I said at the very start right in their face, and they're dealing with it a lot more than the rest of us are. And if you're a teacher who teaches content about these kinds of things, you'll see that your Muslim boys are exposed to a heck of a lot more in terms of how the world represents them than their non-Muslim peers. So they're very aware of what they're up against in some senses. So there's a lot to do, but I think that if you don't start thinking about the strategy before you start doing the good work, then the good work is going to get completely lost in some senses. I was really hoping to have time for questions, and I don't know if I do. Does anybody, Appy, you had your hand up before. I don't know if you want to ask what it was that you had to ask. No.
Okay, sorry, couldn't find the unmute button.
That's okay.
Regarding, I do the ethnic minority support in the school that I work with. Mm-hmm. I have tried engaging with parents through a lot of the things you've already said, except for the iftar. Is there any other way apart from that you see that connection to connect with the parents? My success has always been the phone call home.
Yeah, phone call home. Yeah, we find that, I mean, phone call homes work for a lot of people, right? But that personal touch of having someone phone home, we have found has been really helpful. And also it's difficult because I'm one of the only Muslim colleagues at the school that I currently work in, and it's not got a history of having a lot of Muslim colleagues at the school, not by not wanting to, just happens to be the experience. And I do wonder if some of my success is because I am a Muslim colleague at the school. And I have had parents actively tell me how pleased they are to see me at the school, how excited they are to see a Muslim working at such a prestigious establishment. And I do wonder if I have a benefit in that sense, in that we've got some shared identity traits. and that has a way in. In the book, in Summer's book, Muslim Mothers and Their Children's Education, there are lots of strategies that are mentioned in there, and things that parents have said that they have liked and haven't liked about engagement with schools. So one thing is PTA, and that they really wanted to be involved with the PTA, but that
almost like to get them to be part of the PTA. When I brought this up in conversation, it's like I have to set up a Pakistani PTA for it to work. And then I just felt very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable with that. I mean, one thing we're looking to is have a committee that will run the iftar. So we've always done it as a school issued thing. We offer it out to people and we pay for it, and we've had charities help with it, and it's just a thing that we host, right? But I have said if we had a committee of people that organised it, I actually think that would offer a better way in, and it would mean that there's more regular contact with people as well. But the book is excellent, and there's lots of good strategies in there too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going to stop everybody because I know everyone wants to get to other sessions as well. So thank you for listening patiently. If you've got any more questions, you can always, I'd say tweet me, but yeah, tweet me. Let's see how that goes, or drop me an email. And I hope you guys all have an excellent day with all the other sessions as well. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.